The regime was thinking that, well, these are kids, they're going to go away. And then, of course, they're completely conspiratorial in their thinking.
Mm-hmm.
They constantly think that these are all the instigations and provocations of foreign powers. These are the great Satan, the United States. This is Israel, or these are actually the supreme leader says in so many words. His only response so far that he had in the past 6 weeks with regard to these demonstrations is that these are the children of the Savak being the security forces of the Shah's time. That's 43 years later, he claims that the children, 16, 17 years, 20 years old, kids in the street are the grandchildren or children of some imaginary survival of the Shah security force.
So there's the idea is that these protests are internal and external saboteurs, so people trying to sabotage the government.
Yes.
And
they are misled. That's
misled.
as far as they can go.
And then there's the great Satan, United States, and other places are controlling, sort of either controlling the narrative, feeding propaganda, or literally sending people to
I don't
instigate.
think that they have. I don't think even they have that kind of imagination, precisely to say what you have said.
Yeah.
That they would say that they're controlling the narrative. They basically say, no, these are agents
Yeah.
of the foreign powers. And their families are all sold out, and they are basically lost their loyalties to the great Islamic Republic. And therefore, they can be treated so brutally, they can be suppressed so brutally, which I haven't actually said what they're doing, because I thought perhaps first we should talk about who these kids are in the streets before we move on about the response of the government. But one major factor which seems to add to the anxiety of, the regime is extremely anxious now because they're in a position. This shows that they don't have the lack of confidence, in a sense, that they would see them reacting in a very forceful way, because basically they don't seem to have that kind of a confidence to allow this this message or the movement to be aired. But the one element which corresponds to that is that there is a expatriate population of Iranians worldwide. There are probably now, according to some estimates, close to 4 million, even more, Iranians abroad. And they're all over the world, from Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Western Europe, Turkey, and United States and Canada.
Mm-hmm.
So just to give you one example, last Saturday, there was a mass demonstrations in Berlin
Mm-hmm.
by the Iranians from Germany and all over Europe, Western Europe. And it was at least, I think probably the conservative estimate was about 100,000. So 100,000 Iranians showed up in Berlin demonstrating against the treatment of the women in Iran, or the movement in Iran. The government thinks, obviously, this must have been some instigation by foreign powers, and they want to destroy the Islamic Republic. And not only that, but their propaganda is kind of ridiculous, because I listened actually to how they portrayed it in the newspapers. I listened to the Iranian news that is officially controlled, government-controlled news. And in the papers, there's much of the papers that are in the control of the government. One of them, or actually the major news program, portrayed the demonstrations that 10,000 people showed up in Berlin and protested against the rising prices or rising rates for gas and oil in Germany.
Yes.
So that's how they mislead in a very rather stupid fashion, because probably 95%, if not 100% of the Iranians are listening to Persian-speaking media outside Iran. So it's a BBC Persian. There is Iran International. There are at least 5 or 6 of them.
That's probably really important to highlight that Iran is a very modern and tech savvy nation. Not
Very
just the
much
young
so.
people.
Probably more than I feel sometimes when I compare myself to what they are doing.
Yeah.
Since 1979, the earlier years, for a decade or two, they tried in a very crude fashion to restrict access to media outside Iran, because this is all through dishes, okay? And satellite dishes are everywhere. If you look at the, buildings of small towns and villages in Iran, there's always a dish, and they watch all kinds of things through this. And particularly because of what's happening now, they listen to all the news broadcasts from all this media, and they're extremely active. There are probably some of them even 24 hours or close, very extensive coverage of every clip that comes through. So what the government is doing now, the Islamic Republic, is that they restrict the entire internet.
They shut down the internet.
They shut down the internet, but they cannot afford shutting down the internet because much of the business, much of the everyday life, much of the government affairs depends on the internet, like everywhere else. And Iran is extremely, if I hear from many of the colleagues and friends, it's like, in certain respects, it's like Sweden, where you go there is no more currency, and for a very good reason, because there's so much inflation that the banknotes are worthless in a sense. So everything is through, sweeping your card. And that the entire system is in a standstill because people cannot buy food. You go to the supermarket. That's how you would do it. You order food to come to your house, which Iranians do, at least the middle classes, the more prosperous middle classes, doing all the time. So they deliver everything, and because of the COVID, it became even more. And they have to pay all through this system. So what happens is that now they're estimating that every day $50 million the Iranian government or the Iranian economy is losing because of slowing the internet.
Plus, the frustration is growing,
of course,
because you can't order food.
Among other things,
right?
I mean, they are in touch with, WhatsApp.
Yeah,
every Iranian, virtually every Iranian.
Yeah,
that has education, and education in the sense that has gone through the high schools and universities, knows how to use the WhatsApp.
So there's a big middle class, like you said, secular middle class in Iran, and there's a lot of at least capacity for, if not revolution, then political, ideological turmoil,
and a huge amount of hatred.
So the hatred is growing.
Yes, hatred of the policies of the regime, of isolation. That's a huge point that you hear a great deal about. That we don't want to be isolated. We don't want to be humiliated. Iran is not about this miserable regime that is ruling over us. We have a great culture. So there's a sense of a pride in their own culture, some of it, Islamic, some of it pre-Islamic. So there's a huge sense of a pride in that. And they see that they cannot communicate with the outside world. They want to travel abroad, which they do. I mean, for one thing, the Iranian regime never actually, for majority of the population, never puts restrictions. It's not like Soviet Union, where you have to have you used to have a permission to move from one place to another. And then, of course, the the Islamic regime since 1979 basically chased away or destroyed the old middle class. That's my generation, basically, or my parents' generation. These are the secular middle class of the Pahlavi era, in the hope that they can do this social engineering and create this Islamic society of their own. The bad news for them was that that didn't happen, and that memory persisted, and the middle class that was created since past 40 years is much larger in size than what it was, because there was, of course, the demographic revolution. That's a very foundation of it is the demographic revolution. Population in Iran, I've written an article about it actually. Population in Iran since the turn of the century, last century, that's 20th century, population of Iran was about 9 million or so, is now 83 million. And that is, since 1979, the population was 35 million. Between the past 40 years, it's basically doubled. So it's 83 million. Although, one of the great successes, I don't want to bore you with the details about the demography, but it's important.
Please. Demographics is not boring.
You can see that the birth rate was very high. Otherwise, you wouldn't have doubled your population in a matter of 4 decades.
Yeah.
But Iranians, because of the urban shift to an urban population, because of the growth of the middle class, because of the education, they basically, the pattern of the of growth, population growth changed. Mm-hmm. Iran used to be 2.8 or 3% birth rate in around 1980s, I would say 1970s, 1980s. Now it is 1.1. And it's probably the most successful country in the Middle East in terms of the population control, despite the government consistent attempt to try to encourage people to have more kids. Middle class refuses to do that. And this is middle class not only anymore in the capital, but this is very smaller towns and cities, places that used to be villages. Now you look at them, they have a decent population, 50,000, 100,000, and they live an urban life, and they don't want to be subjected to that old pattern of agrarian society when you had 10 children or 8 children. And of course, it's a much more advanced in terms of health and medicine. So you don't lose children as they used to. The antibiotics, there's all ways of kids to survive. And therefore, if you have 10 kids, you stick with 10 kids. You don't end up with 4 as it used to be in the past. 6 of them would have died up to the age of 5, actually. But now, because of that, you see that this urban population in the cities have completely different demands. And of course, the education is important. That's another area of how the social engineering of the Islamic Republic went awry, because they were thinking that, the growth of the population, the growth of the higher educated middle classes in their benefit, or they could not even control it in a sense. Now, Iran, in my time, probably had, in the 1970s, probably by the time of the revolution, had 10, 12 universities. Now it has 56 universities all across the country. And there is something referred to as the Free University, Azad, which has campuses all over the country. It has 321 campuses all around Iran. What does that mean? In many respects, this youth that are brought up in these families, even in small towns, in very traditional families, in families that belong to that kind of a more religious, loyal to the clergy or to the clerical classes, their children can now move on, which particularly women, because in my times it would have been unheard of that you would have a young woman of 18 or 17, 18, 19 from a traditional city such as, for instance, Yazd or in southeastern Iran, to move on elsewhere for education, as you do in this country. Okay, now it's completely accepted that a woman wears hijab because she's forced to wear hijab to go to a university completely on the other side of the country. And this movement of the population, not only because of the universities, but in general, if you now visit Iran, you hear accents, local accents, I mean, provincial accents, all over the country. That is a Azerbaijani Turkish accent from the northwest of the country. You can hear it in the Fars province in the south, and vice versa. So, and Kurdish, for instance, or even more marginal regions such as Sistan province in the southeast of Iran, which has been the subject of this recent massacre when they actually attacked the population when demonstrating and killed a fair number of at least 60 people. So this movement of the population, this creation of a larger middle class, the better educated middle class, much better educated. Iran has 86% literacy, which I think probably, I haven't checked that, but probably is better than Turkey even. Is probably better than anywhere else in the Middle East.
And it sounds like that's quickly increasing. So
Yes,
because of the movement, because of the growth of the education system,
precisely. Iran has 1 million school teachers, which may not seem as much if you're in the United States, but it's a fairly big number.